and achievements I am so inexpressibly proud have prospered and flourished.
The investigation was never meant to become public. Charles read the final report alone, and by the time he put it down, Camilla's titles were already in jeopardy. The investigation nobody saw coming. There is a particular kind of silence that descends on Buckingham Palace when something is wrong at the very top, not the ordinary quiet of an institution that conducts most of its serious business behind closed doors. Something different, a stillness that the people who work inside those walls, the courtiers, the senior aides, the household staff who have spent decades reading the emotional temperature of the monarchy, the way sailors read the weather, recognize immediately and instinctively. It is the silence of a secret being kept by people who understand exactly how much depends on keeping it. That silence settled over the palace in the early weeks of 2026. And for several days, almost nobody outside a very small circle of senior officials knew why. What was happening, quietly, deliberately, and with a level of institutional seriousness that had not been seen inside the palace in living memory, was an investigation. Not a parliamentary inquiry, not an external legal review triggered by a public complaint or a media revelation. Something far more significant than either of those things. An urgent internal investigation commissioned by the one person in the entire institution whose authority to order such a thing was beyond question. King Charles III himself. Think about what that means for a moment. A reigning monarch, a man who has navigated decades of personal scandal, institutional crisis, and the most scrutinized family life in the world, felt compelled to order an urgent investigation into conduct occurring inside his own household. Not into a disgraced prince, not into a rogue courtier or a leaking aide, into circumstances directly connected to the woman he married, fought for, and placed beside him on the throne of England. That decision alone, before a single finding had been documented or a single interview conducted, tells you everything about how serious the situation had become. The investigation was commissioned in the second week of January 2026. According to sources with direct knowledge of its authorization, Charles made the decision following a private briefing from a senior palace official whose identity has not been disclosed publicly. That briefing, described by sources as deeply troubling in both its content and its implications, presented Charles with a pattern of conduct that his own instincts had apparently been registering for some time, but which he had until that moment chosen to address through private conversation rather than formal inquiry. Something in that briefing changed his calculus entirely. Something convinced him that private conversation was no longer sufficient, that what was unfolding inside his own household required documentation, verification, and the kind of formal institutional response that could not be walked back or quietly absorbed once it was set in motion. He gave the authorization that same evening, and by the following morning, the investigation was already underway. The team assembled to conduct it was small by design. 3 senior officials drawn from the palace's most trusted inner circle, each with a background that combined legal precision with an intimate understanding of how the royal household actually operates beneath its ceremonial surface. They were given a mandate that was, sources say, remarkably broad in its scope. They were instructed to examine specific conduct concerns, to follow every connected thread regardless of where it led, and to report their findings directly and exclusively to the king. No copies distributed to other family members, no briefings to external advisors, no leaks managed through the usual channels of royal press management. The findings would go to Charles and to Charles alone. That last detail is the one that should stop you cold. Because in an institution as layered and politically complex as the British monarchy, the decision to restrict the flow of an investigation's findings to a single person is never accidental. It is a choice that reflects either an extraordinary level of personal trust or an extraordinary level of personal suspicion. And given what the investigation was examining and who it was examining, there is very little doubt about which of those two things was driving it. What exactly had Charles been told in that private briefing that made him move so decisively and so secretly? That question is the one that palace insiders are still asking, and the answer, when it finally emerges in full, will redefine everything you thought you understood about the current state of the British crown. What the investigation actually found. There is a moment in every serious institutional inquiry when the people conducting it realize that what they were sent to find is considerably smaller than what they have actually discovered. When the thread they were instructed to pull begins unraveling something far larger, far older, and far more structurally significant than the original mandate ever anticipated. That moment arrived for the 3 senior officials conducting Charles's private investigation sometime in the 3rd week of January 2026. And according to sources familiar with the process, when it arrived, the atmosphere inside the small, secured room where the inquiry team was working changed in a way that none of them had prepared themselves for. What had begun as a review of specific conduct concerns, narrow in its initial focus and expected by those who authorized it to produce findings that were serious but containable, had expanded, rapidly and in directions that nobody inside that room had predicted when the investigation began. The first thread they pulled was the one they had been sent to examine, a series of communications that had taken place between Camilla's private office and individuals outside the palace whose connection to the royal household had no formal authorization. Not casual social correspondence, not the ordinary informal contact that any public figure maintains with a network of friends and associates. Structured, purposeful communication that discussed palace affairs, institutional decisions, and internal family matters in ways that went considerably beyond what Camilla's role as queen consort either required or permitted. The investigators documented it carefully, categorized it, and moved on to the next thread. That next thread led somewhere that made the first finding look almost routine by comparison. Cross-referencing the communications with the palace's internal decision log, the inquiry team identified a series of instances in which institutional decisions had been influenced, delayed, or redirected in ways that could be traced back to information flowing through those unauthorized channels. In plain language, what the investigation was beginning to suggest was that confidential palace business had been shared with people outside the institution, and that those people had, in certain documented instances, used that information to shape outcomes in ways that served interests other than the crown's. Now, hold that thought. Because it connects directly to the third thread, and the third thread is where the investigation crossed from serious into something that sources describe only as devastating. The inquiry team, following the trail of communications and their institutional consequences, arrived at a cluster of decisions made over the preceding 18 months that bore Camilla's direct or indirect authority. Decisions about access, decisions about resource allocation, decisions about which individuals were granted proximity to the palace's internal processes and which were quietly excluded. When those decisions were mapped against the external communications the team had already documented, a pattern emerged that was, according to one source with knowledge of the findings, impossible to interpret charitably. The people who had been receiving confidential information through Camilla's unauthorized channels were the same people who had subsequently benefited from the institutional decisions her influence had shaped. Ask yourself what that pattern describes, because the investigators asked themselves the same question. And the answer they arrived at, documented across the pages of a report that only Charles has seen in its entirety, is the answer that put Camilla's titles in jeopardy. But the findings did not stop there, because the investigators, following their mandate to pursue every connected thread, regardless of where it led, had also examined something that sources say Charles had specifically requested be included in the inquiry scope. The question of Camilla's continued relationship with Sarah Ferguson, and what, if any, institutional consequences that relationship had produced. What they found on that particular thread was not criminal. It was not even, in isolation, dramatically scandalous. But in the context of everything else the investigation had uncovered, it carried a weight that sources describe as the detail that moved Charles from troubled to resolved. Documented evidence showed that on at least 3 specific occasions, information discussed in private palace meetings attended by Camilla had subsequently appeared in detail and with accuracy that ruled out coincidence, in media coverage that sources close to Sarah Ferguson had either facilitated or directly provided. 3 occasions, documented, verified, placed in sequence against the timeline of palace meetings, and subsequent media reports with a forensic precision that left no reasonable alternative explanation standing. Charles received the completed report on the morning of January 28, 2026. He read it alone. He asked for no company, no counsel, and no immediate briefing from the investigation team. He simply read it in the same quiet, unhurried manner that those who know him describe as the way he processes things that carry the greatest personal weight. And when he finished, he sat with it for a long time before he reached for anything or spoke to anyone. What he did next, and how quickly he did it, is the chapter that changes everything. Camilla's conduct and the line she crossed. To truly understand what the investigation documented, you cannot simply read the findings in isolation. You have to go back through 18 months of decisions, conflicts, and quiet confrontations that palace insiders had been watching with increasing unease. Because the behavior that ultimately landed inside a formal royal investigation did not appear suddenly or without warning. It built, slowly, consistently, and with the kind of incremental escalation that is easy to dismiss at each individual stage and impossible to ignore when you finally lay every stage out in sequence and look at the whole picture at once. Sarah Ferguson. Because Sarah is where the loyalty conflict that defines this entire story has its deepest roots and its most damaging consequences. Camilla and Sarah Ferguson have been friends since the 1970s. That friendship predates both women's entry into the royal family. It predates the marriages, the scandals, the divorces, and the decades of public reinvention that each of them has navigated in their own way. For Camilla, it represents something rare and genuinely precious, a relationship built on a foundation that has nothing to do with titles, proximity to power, or the carefully managed social architecture of palace life. A friendship that simply exists because two people chose each other long before the crown had any opinion on the matter. That loyalty is, in human terms, entirely understandable. But here is the problem. And it is a problem that William identified long before Charles's investigation made it a matter of formal institutional record. Sarah Ferguson is not simply a friend with complicated history. She is a woman whose name appears in documents connected to the Jeffrey Epstein network, a woman whose financial communications with Epstein have been made public through legal proceedings in the United States. A woman whose former husband, Prince Andrew, was arrested in February of 2026 on charges tied directly to that same network. In the context of the most damaging scandal the modern monarchy has ever faced, Camilla's visible, warm, and unapologetic loyalty to Sarah Ferguson was not a private matter. It was an institutional liability of the First Order. William had told her this directly. Charles had raised it privately. Senior courtiers had communicated through every available channel that the relationship needed to be publicly distanced, carefully managed, and kept far from anything connected to official palace business. Camilla heard all of it, and according to the investigation's findings, she made a choice. She continued the friendship on her own terms, maintained regular private contact, and on at least one documented occasion facilitated Sarah's access to a palace-adjacent social event in a manner that directly contradicted the institutional position Charles and William had both clearly stated. That was the first line, and she crossed it knowingly. But the investigation found something beyond the Ferguson loyalty that sources describe as considerably more troubling in its institutional implications. Over the preceding 18 months, Camilla had developed a pattern of what the inquiry team formally categorized as unauthorized influence over internal palace communications. Specifically, her private office had been operating as an informal clearinghouse for information that should have remained within the formal boundaries of the palace's decision-making structure. Sensitive discussions about estate management, succession planning logistics, and the internal reform agenda that William had been developing with Charles's blessing were finding their way outside those boundaries, not through dramatic leaks or deliberate sabotage. Through something more subtle and in many ways more dangerous, casual disclosure. The kind of information sharing that happens when someone in a position of enormous institutional access does not fully respect or does not fully accept the boundaries that position carries with it. The investigation documented instance after instance of this pattern, and when the inquiry team placed those instances alongside the timeline of events that had complicated William's reform agenda over the same period, the connection was not circumstantial, it was sequential, documented, and in the clinical language of the investigation report, described as a consistent pattern of conduct incompatible with the duties and responsibilities of the Queen Consort's office. Now, we arrive at the line, the specific documented singular act that sources describe as the moment the investigation shifted from serious to irreversible. The moment Charles understood that what he was dealing with could no longer be managed through private conversation, family loyalty, or the quiet institutional diplomacy that the palace has historically deployed to absorb uncomfortable truths without confronting them directly. In December of 2025, a private meeting took place at Windsor Castle. The meeting concerned a specific element of William's succession preparedness' agenda, a topic of the most acute institutional sensitivity given Charles's ongoing health challenges. Present at that meeting were a small number of senior officials, Charles himself and Camilla. The content of that meeting, its specific subject matter, the positions taken by those present, and a particular decision reached by Charles during the course of it was not recorded in any distributed minutes. It was not briefed to any external advisor. It existed by design only in the memories of the people who had been in that room. 6 days later, a detailed and accurate account of that meeting appeared in a media outlet with known connections to sources inside Sarah Ferguson's social circle. 6 days, 1 meeting, 0 distributed records, and a media report so specific in its detail that the investigation team, when they examined it, concluded in formal written findings that the disclosure could only have originated from someone who had been physically present in that room. There was only one person present in that room whose loyalty the investigation had already documented as conflicted. Only one person whose pattern of unauthorized information sharing had already been formally recorded. Only one person whose continued friendship with the individual, connected to the outlet's known sources, had been raised as an institutional concern at the highest level and explicitly ignored. Charles read that finding on the morning of January 28th. And that, sources say, was the moment the decision was made. Not the pattern, not the communications, not the Ferguson loyalty or the unauthorized influence or the reform agenda interference. That one finding, that one meeting, that one leak. Because in an institution built on the absolute sanctity of private counsel, there is no more fundamental betrayal than speaking outside the room. And Charles, who had defended Camilla against every attack the public and the press had ever mounted, who had sacrificed his own reputation across 30 years to place her where she now sat, understood in that moment that the person he had protected all that time had not extended him the same courtesy. Charles makes the decision. There is a particular quality to the way King Charles III makes his most consequential decisions. Those who have worked closely with him over decades describe it consistently and in almost identical terms. He is not impulsive. He does not react. He absorbs, he processes, he sits with the weight of something until he understands it completely. And then he acts with a calm, deliberate finality that leaves no room for the impression that what he has decided could be undecided. It is the quality of a man who has spent his entire life preparing for moments that most people never face. And on the morning of January 28, 2026, that quality was being tested in a way that nothing in his preparation had ever fully anticipated. He had read the report. He had sat with it, and now he had to decide what to do about the woman sleeping under the same roof. The decision Charles faced that morning was not simply personal, it was constitutional, institutional, and historical in its implications. Because stripping a queen consort of royal titles is not a matter of issuing a press release or making a phone call to a palace communications team. It is a formal act of sovereign authority that carries the full weight of centuries of royal precedent. It requires specific legal mechanisms, specific constitutional consultations, and a specific chain of documentation that, once initiated, cannot be quietly reversed if someone later decides the consequences are inconvenient. When a monarch sets that process in motion, they are not expressing displeasure. They are making a permanent institutional statement that will be recorded in the history of the crown forever. Charles understood all of that, and he initiated the process anyway. His first call that morning was not to William. It was not to the Prime Minister or the Archbishop of Canterbury. It was to Sir Anthony Woodhouse, the palace's most senior constitutional legal advisor, a man whose entire professional existence is devoted to understanding the precise mechanisms through which royal authority can be formally exercised. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. When it ended, Sir Anthony left for the palace immediately. What Charles had asked him to prepare was, according to sources with knowledge of the exchange, something Sir Anthony had never been asked to prepare in his entire career: a formal legal framework for the modification of a sitting queen consort's titular status under sovereign authority. The constitutional mechanism Charles chose to employ is one that has existed within royal legal architecture for centuries, but has never been applied in its current form in the modern era. Under sovereign prerogative, a monarch retains the authority to modify, suspend, or formally review the titular designations associated with members of the royal household when specific conditions of conduct incompatible with royal duty have been formally documented and verified through an authorized internal process. The investigation Charles had commissioned in January had been structured, sources now reveal, with precisely this mechanism in mind: the mandate given to the inquiry team, the documentation standards they were instructed to apply, the chain of verification built into their reporting process. All of it had been designed from the very beginning to produce findings that would satisfy the constitutional threshold required to activate sovereign prerogative over titular status. Charles had not simply ordered an investigation. He had ordered the legal foundation for a decision he had already, on some level, been preparing himself to make. The formal documentation was prepared over the course of 3 days. During those 3 days, Charles maintained his public schedule without visible disruption. He received visitors, he conducted audiences, he appeared at one public engagement where he was photographed smiling with the kind of practiced composure that only someone raised inside the monarchy from birth could produce while carrying what he was carrying privately. Nobody outside the immediate circle of Sir Anthony and 2 senior palace officials knew what was being prepared. Not William, not Princess Anne, not the Prime Minister's office. Nobody. On the morning of January 31st, 2026, Charles signed the formal documentation, and in doing so, set in motion a process that would, within days, alter Camilla's position within the British monarchy in ways she had never imagined possible and had certainly never been warned to prepare for. The signed documentation was witnessed, sealed, and placed within the royal archives under a classification level that restricted access to fewer than 5 living individuals. And then Charles did something that those who know him say was perhaps the most revealing detail of this entire episode. He went for a walk alone in the gardens at Sandringham. No aides, no protection officers at close quarters. Just a king, a winter garden, and the particular silence of a man who has done something irreversible and is making his peace with it. What Camilla discovered when the formal notification reached her and what happened inside the palace in the hours that followed is a story that those present describe as unlike anything they have witnessed in their years of royal service. Camilla's world collapses. The formal notification arrived at Camilla's private office on the morning of February 3rd, 2026, not delivered through the ordinary channels of palace internal correspondence, not handed to a senior aide who would brief her gently over morning tea in the manner that difficult institutional news is typically managed inside the royal household. It arrived formally, officially, and with the unmistakable legal weight of a document that had been prepared by constitutional advisors and signed by a reigning monarch. There was no softening, there was no preamble, there was no private conversation beforehand that might have allowed her to compose herself before the full reality of what Charles had decided landed in her hands. She read it once. And then, according to sources present in the adjoining room, there was silence. A long, complete, and terrible silence that lasted several minutes, and during which nobody on her staff moved or spoke or breathed with any particular confidence. What broke that silence was not tears. It was not the kind of visible emotional collapse that the public might imagine when picturing a woman discovering that the king has formally initiated a process to strip her of the titles she fought 30 years of scandal and public hatred to claim. What broke it was something colder, and in many ways more frightening to the people in that room. Camilla picked up the telephone and called her lawyer. Within 2 hours, her full legal team had been summoned to the palace. 3 senior solicitors with backgrounds in constitutional law and royal household procedure arrived within the hour, were shown into a private meeting room and spent the remainder of the morning in close session with Camilla and her most trusted senior aide. What was discussed in that room has not been disclosed, but sources with knowledge of the afternoon that followed described the legal team's collective assessment as having produced, in one advisor's privately shared words, a deeply uncomfortable conclusion. The mechanism Charles had employed was constitutionally sound. The documentation was airtight. The investigative process that underpinned it had been structured with sufficient legal precision to withstand any formal challenge. There was, in the plainest possible terms, nothing to appeal, nothing to overturn, nothing to argue. Camilla had been outmaneuvered completely, and the person who had done it was her own husband. Tom Parker Bowles arrived at the palace that afternoon. Sources describe his arrival as visibly agitated, his composure notably absent in a way that those who know him say is extremely rare. He had understood, faster than almost anyone outside the immediate situation, what the formal modification of his mother's titular status would mean for everything he had been building in its shadow. Every door that had opened because of who his mother was, every investor conversation that had proceeded because of the implicit proximity to royal legitimacy her position provided, every commercial venture, every heritage branding proposal, every luxury hospitality scheme that had been constructed on the foundation of a queen consort's reflected prestige. All of it was now standing on ground that had just been formally removed from beneath it. He met with Camilla privately for 40 minutes. What passed between them is known only to the two people who were in that room. But when Tom left the palace that afternoon, 3 scheduled public appearances were canceled before the end of the day. His publicist cited fatigue. Nobody in the palace believed it. Meanwhile, the rest of the royal family was processing the news in ways that told their own revealing story. William, when informed by Charles of what had been decided and executed, said very little according to sources close to him. He had not been consulted in advance, had not been part of the constitutional preparation, and had not known the formal notification had been issued until after it was already in Camilla's hands. His response, sources say, was a single quiet acknowledgement that Charles had done what needed to be done. Nothing more. Princess Anne, characteristically, expressed herself with the kind of compressed precision that those who know her recognize as the most eloquent communication style in the entire family. She reportedly told a senior courtier simply that her mother had always known who could be trusted with the things that mattered most, and Charles himself. Where was Charles during the hours that Camilla's world was collapsing around her? In his private study, conducting scheduled correspondence, receiving one planned visitor, and maintaining the complete outward composure of a monarch for whom the institution has always, in the final reckoning, come before everything else, including love, including loyalty, including the 30 years of personal cost he had paid to place beside him the woman who had now, in the most formally documented terms possible, given him reason to question whether the cost had been fully understood by both of them. The palace watched all of it in the particular silence that descends when something historic has happened, and everyone present knows it, but nobody is yet certain what they are permitted to say. That silence is still reverberating, and what it means for the monarchy going forward is the question that makes everything else in this story matter. The monarchy? After Camilla, what comes next? Strip away the legal documentation, the constitutional mechanisms, the signed and sealed sovereign instruments placed under restricted classification in the royal archives, and what you are left with is something very simple and very human. A king who loved a woman enough to endure 30 years of public hatred on her behalf, who placed her beside him on the throne of England against every institutional instinct and public preference, and who then discovered that the trust required to sustain that position had been broken in the one way he could not absorb, overlook, or privately forgive. That is the human story beneath everything that has unfolded inside Buckingham Palace since January of 2026. And it is the story that makes everything that comes next carry the particular weight of genuine tragedy rather than simple institutional consequence. But institutions do not pause for tragedy. They continue. They adapt, they transform. And the British monarchy, which has survived everything history has thrown at it across 1,000 years, is already transforming in ways that will define it for the next generation. Camilla's formal titular modification does not leave a vacuum. It leaves a clarity, A clean, unambiguous, constitutionally documented statement about where the boundaries of royal conduct lie and what happens when those boundaries are crossed by someone operating at the very highest level of the institution. That clarity is itself a form of institutional communication directed not just at the family inside the palace, but at the watching public outside it. A monarchy that holds its own queen consort formally accountable is making an argument about itself that no press release, no carefully staged public appearance, and no amount of royal communications management could ever make as powerfully. William understands this. It is, in many ways, precisely the argument he has been making through every decision he has taken since inheriting the Duchy of Cornwall, the blocked funds, the removed payroll names, the frozen authorizations. Each individual action was a sentence in a paragraph he has been writing about what kind of institution the monarchy will be when it passes to him. Charles's decision has now added the most definitive sentence yet, and it was written not by William, but by his father, which gives it a weight and a legitimacy that even William's most decisive unilateral actions could never fully carry alone. For Catherine, whose own journey through illness, recovery, and quiet, dignified return to public life has made her the most trusted figure in the entire royal family, this moment represents something she has never sought but cannot avoid. She is now, in every meaningful sense, the future of the feminine face of the British crown, not by ambition, not by maneuver, simply by being the person who remained standing when everything around her was tested and who conducted herself through every test in a manner that the institution and the public could unreservedly respect. Queen Elizabeth II saw all of this coming. Every arrangement, every covenant, every carefully constructed legal protection she built around William in her final years whispers the same quiet truth. She always knew. And now, finally, so does everyone else.